Hello, my dear friends. In this story, I want to tell you how one random delivery awakens something wild and unbridled in me. Make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and follow me all the way to the end. It's going to be hot, I promise. My name is Kyle, I'm 25 years old, and I'm a typical guy who loves freedom, partying, and isn't afraid to challenge himself. When I got a job as a delivery boy at Luigi's, a small pizza place in a suburb of Seattle, I thought it was just a way to earn money for the weekend and fuel for my bike. I was just delivering pizza, and I found someone who showed me that I could be me, and it turned my life around. The job was uncomplicated, delivering orders, having a few words with customers, and occasionally catching a generous tip from those who were too lazy to cook. But last September, one rainy night, it was different, and I still remember that evening with a slight shiver and a big smile. Seattle was drenched in fall dampness, with leaves falling from the trees and people scurrying for shelter from the wind and rain in their homes. The pizzeria was buzzing with orders, and I'd been cruising the familiar streets for a couple months now, enjoying the speed and wind in my face on my bike. My shift was nearing the end when manager Tony approached me with another printout in hand. "Kyle, here's an order almost on your route. Can you pick it up on your way out?" He asked, looking at me with a tired grin after a long day. I glanced at my watch. It was almost 11, a cold power drink and a comfy couch were waiting for me at home, but extra bucks were always nice. "Give me the address," I nodded, picking up my order, a large mushroom pizza and a can of soda for some late-night snack. Tony shouted after me, "Don't drive on the wet road, take care of yourself." I grinned as I pulled on my helmet. The streets glistened with rain, the streetlights reflected in the puddles, and I raced through the city, feeling the drops dripping down my jacket and the adrenaline rushing through my blood. The address led me to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts, where neat houses stood with lawns and cars under sheds. House number 15 was one story, with warm light in the windows and light smoke from the chimney. Someone was clearly cozy on this chilly night. I parked the bike, took the hot box out of the bag, and walked to the door, shaking the water off my sleeves and boots. I felt kind of weird, not tired, not the anticipation of something unusual, but I brushed those thoughts aside. I knocked on the door, and a couple seconds later it opened, and behind it stood a man of about 45, with short dark hair and an open smile. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and worn jeans, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and a light aroma of spices wafted from the house. "Good evening, your order, mushroom pizza and soda," I said, trying to sound cheerful despite my soaked clothes. He nodded, gave me a quick glance, and said suddenly, "Come on in, Kyle, warm yourself up a bit, or you're all soaked outside." I was surprised he knew my name. He must have noticed it on my name tag, but his voice was so friendly and relaxed that I didn't argue. Stepping inside, I felt the warmth of home embrace me after the cold road, and he introduced himself. "My name is Ryan, nice to see you." At that moment I didn't realize yet that this night would be the start of something bright and liberating, but a spark was already ignited inside, whispering that something incredible was ahead of me. I stepped into Ryan's house, and the warmth of the room immediately enveloped me, breaking the chill of the September night from the wet streets of Seattle. He closed the door behind me with a careless, "Put the pizza on the table, I'll be right back with the money," and disappeared into the back of the house. Inside, there was the smell of coffee mixed with the light aroma of cedar wood from the fireplace, and music playing quietly somewhere, something quiet, with guitar strumming. I looked around, a wooden table against the wall, a couple of old vinyl records on a shelf, a sofa with a tattered plaid. Everything looked cozy and relaxed. Somehow I felt like a guest, not just a courier, but a guest who was welcome here, and that feeling was unexpectedly pleasant. Ryan returned a minute later, holding a few bills in his hand, and asked with a smile, "Mushroom pizza and a soda, what's it say, $20? I nodded, holding out the check, and noticed him looking at me, not hurriedly, but with a kind of relaxed interest. He handed me $25, adding, "Keep the change, you got your bike wet out there, right?" I thanked him and stuffed the money in my pocket, getting ready to leave, but he suddenly said, "Listen, Kyle, do you want to stay for a couple minutes, get some coffee and warm up?" His voice was so open that I froze, then suddenly agreed, "Okay, I can spare a couple minutes." He nodded, pointed to the couch and went into the kitchen, while I took off my helmet, set it by the door, and flopped down on the soft cushions. He came back with 2 mugs, steam rising from them, and sat down next to me, not too close, but enough for me to feel the warmth of his presence. "How long have you been driving around town with orders?" he asked, taking a sip and looking at me with friendly curiosity. I told him I'd been working for a couple months, that I loved speed and that it was just a way to make a living without too many headaches. The conversation flowed easily, and I found myself relaxing, forgetting about the rain outside the window and the tiredness in my legs. Then he leaned a little closer, setting the mug on the table, and said, "You know, Kyle, you have an energy that you rarely see." His words sounded sincere, and I felt my cheeks flush slightly, though I wasn't used to being embarrassed by such things. "Thanks, I guess," I replied, grinning, and he suddenly moved a little more so that our knees were almost touching. "We can sit longer if you want. I like the way you fill this room," he added quietly, and there was something in his voice that made my heart pound harder. I nodded, not knowing what to say, but feeling the air between us grow warmer and thicker. He turned the music up louder, and we continued chatting, but now his hand touched mine occasionally when he reached for his mug, or a little longer when he laughed at my jokes. It was unobtrusive, but I noticed the way his fingers lingered, leaving a slight warmth on my skin, and I liked it more than I expected. At one point he offered to bring a plaid because the room was getting chilly, and soon we were sitting under it, sharing warmth and laughter. When I finally got up to leave, he walked me to the door and said, "Come by again, Kyle, with or without pizza." I left in the rain, but something new and liberated was burning inside, and I knew I would be back. A couple days after that first meeting, I was back at the pizzeria, sorting orders before another night shift. My phone vibrated, and I saw the familiar address, number 15, a large mushroom pizza and a soda, just like last time. A smile appeared on my face, and I felt a warm anticipation spill inside, even though the rain outside the window was still pounding on the windows. Tony, noticing my reaction, grinned. "Your favorite customer is calling again, Kyle. Don't overdo it there." I just shrugged, but inside I was already imagining being back in that cozy living room with the crackling fireplace. Picking up the box and can, I drove out into the night, enjoying the wet streets of Seattle and the wind that crept under my jacket. When I pulled up to Ryan's house, the lights in the windows were burning softly, and his silhouette was already waiting on the porch, as if he knew I was about to show up. "Kyle, come on in, I thought you were busy today," he said with the same relaxed smile, letting me inside and picking up the pizza. It was easier this time, no awkwardness, just the feeling that we were both happy to see each other without further ado. He suggested I take off my wet jacket and drop it by the fireplace and went to get coffee himself, leaving me in the living room with quiet music playing in the background. I sat down on the couch, feeling the warmth of the fire dispelling the cold from the street, and waited for him, realizing that this evening was going to be special. Ryan came back with 2 mugs and sat down next to me closer than the last time I'd sat down and our knees touched, but neither of us moved away. We chatted about stuff. I told him about my last hangout with my friends. He shared how he'd once fixed an old motorcycle in the garage. Then he stopped talking, looking at me like he was deciding whether or not to say something, and finally he said, "Kyle, you don't mind if I tell you that I like having you around, do you?" His voice was soft, but there was a sincere warmth in it that made me freeze for a second. I replied that I felt good with him too, and he smiled, moving even closer so I could feel the warmth of his breath. "Why don't you stay longer tonight?" he asked, putting his hand on my shoulder, his fingers lightly squeezing the fabric of my t-shirt. I nodded, feeling my heart pound faster, and he reached for the plaid, covering us both to make us cozy. We continued talking, but his hand was on my back now, slowly sliding along my spine, and it felt so natural that I relaxed under his touch. The music played softly and the fireplace cast reflections on the walls, creating an atmosphere where anything seemed possible. At some point, he leaned closer, and I felt his palm linger on my neck, leaving a warmth that spread throughout my body. We turned on some old movie, but I didn't look at the screen much. I was drawn to him, to the way he laughed or fixed the plaid when it slid down. Then he turned to me, and his hand rested gently on my thigh, just resting there as we chatted about nothing. When the clock struck midnight, he asked, "Do you want to stay a little longer?" And I agreed, realizing that this night had turned something inside of me upside down. As I left, I felt freer than I had ever felt before, and I knew that this was just the beginning. After that night, I started to notice that thoughts of Ryan kept me going even on my busiest days. A new order from him, a large mushroom pizza and a soda, came once or twice a week, and each time I found myself looking forward to it. Seattle was drenched in fall rain, but the drive to number 15 had become something of a ritual that dispelled the grayness of everyday life. Tony at the pizza place wasn't joking anymore, just silently handing me a slip of paper with the address on it, glancing around like he knew there was more going on there than just the delivery. I got on the bike, feeling the cold wind creeping under my jacket, but there was an anticipation burning inside that drove me forward. That evening when I pulled up to his house, the porch light was already on, and Ryan met me at the door with a relaxed smile and the words, "Kyle, come on in, I was just thinking about you." He picked up the pizza and I took off my helmet and jacket, tossing them by the fireplace where the wood was already crackling, filling the room with warmth and comfort. It felt like home this time, no extra words, just an understanding that we both wanted to be here and now. He brought coffee, sat down next to me on the couch, so close I could feel the warmth of his shoulder, and we started talking about my friends, about how he'd once traveled up the coast on an old bike. The conversation flowed easily, but I noticed the way his hand rested on my back, as if unintentionally, and stayed there while we laughed about something stupid. "You're awesome, Kyle. Time flies with you," he said, looking at me with a warmth that made me squeeze inside. I replied that I liked spending evenings with him, too, and he moved closer so that our legs touched under the blanket he'd thrown over us. His fingers slid along my shoulder, leaving a slight warmth, and I felt myself relax, letting the sensation fill me completely. We turned on the music, and he put his hand on my thigh, just resting there as we continued to talk about stuff. At one point he offered to bring more coffee, and when he returned, he sat down so that our knees were now pressed tightly together. "Are you comfortable with me?" he asked quietly, and I nodded, feeling his palm gently squeeze my shoulder, as if checking to make sure I was okay with it. I liked the way he moved, confident but not rushed, and I caught myself wanting to stay longer, just soaking up that warmth. We were watching some kind of movie, but I was watching him more, noticing the way he smiled or fixed his hair, and his closeness had a stronger effect on me than I'd expected. When he leaned closer, his hand slid to my neck, lingering there, and I felt my pulse quicken at that simple gesture. The clock struck 1 o'clock in the morning and he asked, "Are you going to stay and talk some more, or are you going home?" I chose the former, and we talked late into the night, sitting under a blanket where his touches grew bolder but remained as natural as ever. As I left, I felt freer than ever and realized that these evenings with Ryan had become a part of me, vibrant, liberated, real. Every time I got on the bike, I already knew I would be back soon, because it was too good to stop. As the weeks passed, seeing Ryan became more than just a pleasant pastime. Each new order from him, a large mushroom pizza and a soda, came as a signal that made me involuntarily quicken my steps to my bike. Seattle was already fully immersed in the autumn gloom, but the road to house number 15 shone with warmth for me, dispelling the grayness of the cold days. Tony at the pizzeria once remarked, "Kyle, you're glowing when you drive to that customer's house." And I grinned, not denying that those evenings had changed me. I became bolder, more liberated, and every time I drove up to his house, I felt something alive and real inside. I arrived a little later than usual that night, and Ryan met me at the door with a wide smile. "Kyle, come on in, I thought you were going to miss today." He picked up the pizza and I threw off my wet jacket by the fireplace where the fire was already burning, filling the living room with coziness and the light smell of wood. We sat down on the couch, and he immediately moved closer, tossing the blanket into our laps as if it were a habit. The conversation started easily. I told him about a stupid fight I'd had with a friend at a party, and he told me about the time he'd gotten stuck on the side of the road with a stalled motorcycle. But soon he stopped talking, looking at me with that warmth that always confused me. "You make me feel more alive, Kyle," he said softly, placing his hand on my back, and his fingers slowly slid down, leaving warmth along my spine. I replied, making my days brighter too, and he moved so close that I could feel his breath on my neck. "Will you stay longer?" he asked, and his palm rested on my thigh, squeezing a little harder than before, but still soft and natural. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken, and he covered us with the plaid entirely, creating our little warm world. His hand stayed on me, moving slowly along my leg, and I relaxed, letting the sensation fill everything inside. We turned on the music, and he pulled even closer so that our shoulders pressed tightly against each other under the soft fabric. "Do you like the way this is going?" he asked, and his fingers slid up my neck, lingering there while I replied that yes, I was more than enjoying it. I felt his warmth flowing over to me, and at one point he leaned in, almost touching my skin, but stopped, just breathing next to me until I pulled in myself. It was like a dance, unobtrusive but full of energy, and I savored every move he made, every moment when his hands found new places to warm me. The movie we'd put on had been playing in the background for a long time, and all I could watch was him, the way he smiled or fixed the plaid when it slid down. When the clock showed 2 in the morning, he asked, "Do you want to stay until morning?" And I agreed, realizing that I didn't want to interrupt this feeling of freedom and intimacy. We talked for another hour, sitting under the comforter where his touches became bolder but still stayed within the confines of our cozy world. Leaving at dawn, I felt different, liberated, confident, alive. Ryan had given me more than I could have expected, and I knew those nights would stay with me forever. It had been almost 2 months since I'd first brought pizza to Ryan's house, and our story had become a part of my life. His orders, a large mushroom pizza and a soda, came regularly, but now I sometimes stopped by without an excuse, just because I wanted to. The winter dampness had already enveloped Seattle, but every time I raced to number 15 on my bike, the cold receded before the warmth that awaited me inside. Tony at the pizza place once said, "Kyle, you hang out there more now than you do here," and I just laughed, not denying that these meetings had become more important to me than work. My friends noticed that I was braver, joked more often, and didn't sweat the small stuff, but I didn't tell them where the change had come from. That night I arrived without a reservation, just called Ryan and told him I'd be there in half an hour, if that was okay with him. He opened the door with the same open smile. "Kyle, come on in, I just fired up the fireplace to warm us both up." The living room was already warm, smelling of coffee and something spicy, and a familiar plaid was lying on the couch as if waiting for our return. We sat down next to each other, and he moved right over, putting his hand on my shoulder and then slowly running his fingers along my neck, as if checking that I was still here with him. The conversation started with nothing. I told him about the stupid traffic jam on the bridge, and he shared how he'd found an old leather vest in the garage. Then he stopped talking, looking at me with that warmth that always made me feel more alive. "You know, Kyle, it's like I'm rediscovering myself with you," he said, and his hand slid down my back, lingering there while I answered that he was doing the same for me. He covered us with the plaid, and I felt his palm rest on my thigh, squeezing a little harder than usual, but still soft and natural. "Are you comfortable like this?" he asked, moving closer, and I nodded, feeling the warmth of his body mingle with mine beneath the fabric. His fingers slid higher, along my leg, and I relaxed, letting the sensation spread throughout my body like a wave. We put on some music, something slow, with a deep bass, and he moved so that our knees were pressed tightly together. His arm was around my neck now, sometimes touching the skin under my collar, and I could feel his breathing getting closer as we chatted about stuff. At one point he leaned over, almost touching my shoulder, and I turned toward him, letting our gazes meet for longer than usual. It was like a game, bold but cozy, and I enjoyed the way his warmth enveloped me, the way his fingers found new points to leave a mark. When the clock struck midnight, he asked, "Will you stay until morning?" And I agreed, knowing I didn't want to interrupt this moment. We talked until dawn, sitting under a blanket where his touch was bold, but as natural as breathing. As I left, I felt freer than I'd ever felt before, and I realized that Ryan had become not just a person to me, but part of my journey, bright, liberated, real. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below.